There have been certainly times when I, look back and say, okay, we tried this, we put so much effort into this, and it seemed like that didn't really work. But then at other times, and that's what's going on right now with us, it's like God is opening the door, and it's, in some ways, it's scary because you're gonna have to change and start doing something on faith and doing something different than what you've done. But the exhilaration of walking there with God and experiencing Him. You said a little bit ago, it's like you're swept up in something that is so many orders of magnitude bigger because it's God who's doing it. Are you satisfied with how you are experiencing God? I'm not. I want more. I'm Dr. Carol, and thank you for being part of this episode with me. The whole experience between us and God is something that, well, frankly, every Christian I have talked with has challenges with. We want so much more. Now, sometimes we kind of cover that over and feel like, well, maybe I am really expecting too much. Maybe that's not what God is all about, and so on. And we settle for too little because we're not experiencing all that our heart desires. I have learned that it's not me. It is what God is doing. And to unpack that a whole lot more, today we're talking about experiencing God. Now, I first read the book Experiencing God maybe 15 years ago. It was one of the recommended books in my seminary theology training, and I just found it rocked my world, and it has continued to be really important. Well, the Blackaby family continues to be used greatly in ministry. Dr. Richard Blackaby, the son of Henry, who wrote the original book, is now head of Blackaby Ministries. The study guide has just been recently updated. Millions of people have used the study guide, and the Experiencing God CSB Bible is out. I'm just going to have a conversation today with Dr. Richard Blackaby about experiencing God, the realities of how He is at work and how He invites us to join in, what that's like. You'll hear some really interesting little stories about what that can look like. I know that you will find this conversation enriching in your own experience with God. Dr. Richard Blackaby. Well, Dr. Richard Blackaby, it is such an honor to have you on the program today. First of all, just thank you. Welcome. Glad you're here.
Oh, thank you. It's my privilege to be with you.
You have been part of such an amazing ministry family. And It may be that some of our listeners or viewers are aware of Experiencing God. I was a little late to the party. I was introduced to Experiencing God in my seminary training about 15 years ago. I know your father had written that, long before, but it really changed my paradigm of seeing God, experiencing God, working with Him. I've got to, through you, thank your father for putting this out there.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, maybe the short version of that, if someone's not familiar with him, my dad grew up in Canada and came down to the States to go to school, and he was pastoring two different churches over that time, and God was blessing, life was good. And then he got a call from a tiny little church, had about 10 people left. It was dying. They actually had a for sale sign out on their property to see if anyone would want to buy their very rundown building. And they contacted my dad because they knew he's from Canada, and they said, if you'll come and be our pastor, we won't shut our doors. So no pressure, but we're going to die if you don't come.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he brought his family of 5 kids. He actually brought his worship pastor and their 3 kids, all moved up to this little church of 10. And basically, Dad was placed in a position where they had no money, no people, no resources, no one to help except God. And they discovered that when you've got God, you have everything you need. And God was not just a doctrine to believe in. He was not someone just to sing songs about in church on
Yeah.
Sunday.
Yeah.
He was actually a person who wanted to interact with you. He wanted to guide you, wanted to be involved in your life. And so my dad really, it took him in a very unique journey. And so he would just talk about what God had done. And people kept looking at him funny, like, well, you keep talking like God's real, like that he talks to you, that he guides you, that he shows you what to do, and then he blesses what you do. And I've just never had that experience. And so he was asked to speak on it here and there. And eventually some people, some publishers heard him and said, hey, we've never heard anything like this.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
need to get this down. And they they put it in a workbook, which has been the most popular form. And workbooks, they printed like 5,000, and they thought they'd be lucky to sell 5,000. It was just not, they didn't expect much. And the last I saw, that workbook in English has sold about 8 million copies in English, and it's been translated into 75 different other languages. And so it was just phenomenon. And people kept saying, Henry, I've gone to church all my life, but I've never known God like this. He
Yes.
became real to me. He became alive to me. I used to think when I died and went to heaven, I'd finally be able to interact with God, but I'm doing that now. And so it's been a joy to see how many people's lives have been changed. And a lot of times they'll say something like, it was like my Christian life was in black and white, and I took experience in God, and I discovered it was meant to be in HD color.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not like I started believing for the first time, but there was so much more to the Christian life than I had any idea about.
Yeah. How old were you when your family moved to Saskatchewan? And you're the oldest, I believe,
Yeah,
of the siblings?
I am. Yeah, I was 8 years old, and so I'd grown up in California. That's all I knew.
Yeah.
Moved to Canada. It was very different for us. It's very hard. We didn't have any money. We it was a lot of hard work for my parents and sacrifice. And but we didn't have a big house. We didn't have a lot of money.
Yeah.
But we grew up in a home. It was kind of like growing up in George Mueller's orphanage. It was,
Oh, wow.
we just kept
Yes.
seeing answers to prayer. And we'd sit around the kitchen table at night, and Dad would just tell us about, hey, we called this pastor to come and didn't have enough money to pay. And just today we got a check and from someone I never met before, and said, we want to help support this pastor. And it was just the amount of money we needed. And just over and over again, we
Yeah.
just saw that how real God was. And so it's not really surprising that all 5 of my dad's children ended up in full-time Christian ministry.
Mm.
And he's got 14 grandkids, and probably half of them, at least at this point, are headed to Christian ministry, or like my son, all my kids actually are in ministry as well.
Oh, what a legacy. For you, the experiencing God framework that your dad wrote about and talked about, and you have built out. You now lead the Blackaby Ministries. Has that stretched you in any way? I know you grew up with it, but what has it meant
Mm-hmm.
for you?
Well, even if you have a spiritual giant for a mother or a father,
Yeah.
there's no freebies. You have to have your own
Yeah.
walk with God. And so I knew it was possible. I'd seen what it looked like, but I still have to have my own walk with God. And so I've had to have my own experiences. And my oldest son is a church planter up in Victoria, Canada. And he moved up there, didn't even have a place to live. And he had a moving truck that was bringing all of his stuff up there. And they said, take about a week to get there. And they had 2 other people's things, possessions on their truck. They said, but you got to tell us an address. We have to know where to deliver this stuff when it gets there. Mike said, how many more days can I have till you need that address? Because I have no idea where I'm even going to live. And that market was very, very tight, very expensive. If something came up for rent, by the time you could contact them, there might be 60 other applicants already.
Mm.
It was just impossible. And so literally the day before the truck's arriving, just in a miraculous means, just only God could have done it.
Yeah.
They find a place, it's available by the next day. And they literally just at the last moment, they tell the truck to deliver it here to this address. And it was interesting afterward. My son said, he said, Dad, I've grown up hearing all the incredible stories of how God worked in my grandfather's life. He said, I grew up in your home and I've seen a bunch of God things, but now I'm having my own God stories. And
Yes.
I said, well, every generation, it's great to rehearse what God did in previous generations, but what you really want is your own God stories.
Yes.
Mm.
Amazing. The among many things, part of what this book and this framework changed in me, um, so much of where I had what my Christian life had been is, especially working for God, had been, okay, I think this is what I'm supposed to do, and then God come, please bless it.
Yeah.
This paradigm turned that on its head. It's
Yeah.
not that we decide what we want to be done and ask God to come bless it. We're not the leader, He is.
Yeah.
That completely turned everything on its head for me.
Yeah, and my dad would say, we didn't like to hear this, but he would say, so many Christians have been raised up in a very self-centered
Yes.
religion. It's all about me. I think I want to do this, so God bless me, and
Yeah.
then if God doesn't bless what I want to do, then it's like, what's wrong with God? Why doesn't He love
Yep.
me?
Yep.
And but it also puts a lot of pressure on people. If you're a pastor, or if you're trying to raise some kids and you feel all the pressure, it's up to you to figure out what needs to be done. Do you intervene? Do you have tough love?
Yep.
What do you do? But when all of a sudden you realize, no, that's all, God's got all that. Like, He knows what is best. You don't have to figure it out. Just learn how to follow His lead, and step by step He'll show you just what you need to do in that moment. And so many people have said it's so freeing to me. I just took such a
Yes.
load off of me. I thought it was up to me, and I felt like such a failure if I couldn't figure out how to grow this church, grow this ministry, whatever it was, raise these kids. And all of a sudden it was just, okay, God, what do I do next? And
Mm-hmm.
it became very freeing and very simple in many ways. We've sort of complicated the Christian life in a lot of ways, and I don't think it's meant to be.
Yeah. The story your dad uses is the baseline here, and I know your whole ministry has built this out. Moses, he
Yeah.
senses that God has called him to deliver Israel. He starts doing it on his own, and he kills one Egyptian, and then has to flee to the backside of the desert. 40 years later, God says, "Okay, now do this," and he learned the difference between, "Okay, this is what I think should be done," and following God.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you would just take a minute, and maybe for those who might not have been aware of experiencing God framework, talk about that pattern of how
Mhm.
God's in charge and how we come to experience Him.
Yeah, the in the experience of God, my dad talks about seven realities, and he tried to get away just from principles, because he believes in principles, but he wanted to make sure that we realized God was more than a principle; He was a person, and so the realities were simply describing the ways that this person of God works, and one of the most revolutionary ones was the first reality, which just was that God is always at work around you. And that's revolutionary because a lot of people say, well, I'm just, I'm just a nurse. I'm just a teacher. I just work at a store. I don't do anything important. But all of a sudden they realize, but God loves those people that work in that store, and He loves those customers. And He is working. And if you open your spiritual eyes, you'll discover He's doing all kinds of things that are very exciting. But then God also, another really important reality is that God pursues a love relationship with you. He wants it to be real, wants to be personal. He's not waiting till you get to heaven before He starts loving on you. He wants you to be having that relationship now. Eternal life starts now when you're born again, not when you get to heaven. And so when you begin to experience a God who loves you and wants you to be involved in His work, that's amazing. And one of the other realities is that He invites you to join Him, and we're always inviting Him to join us. God, I want to start this new business. I want to invite you to bless my business. And yet what we don't realize is that God's work is so infinitely greater than our own. And you could spend your whole life trying to pursue your dreams. But when you start building the kingdom of God, you start joining, you're being swept up into God's eternal activity and purposes that He's been carrying out through the ages that will last for an eternity. Tell you what, it makes a lot of our plans seem as puny as they really are.
Yeah.
And so, and then, but for God to do that, He's going to have to speak. He's going to have to communicate with you, and that's probably the most controversial thing my dad taught, is that God speaks to people. And whenever you say that, there's always some who immediately say, well, I've never heard God speak out loud. And of course, when you take the course, Dad said, well, speaking out loud is just one of many ways God communicates. He is his Holy Spirit, if you're a believer, it dwells within you. He doesn't have
Right.
to speak out loud. He can speak straight to your heart, to your spirit. He can prompt you. And what we found is that, like, I can't tell how many people have said, well, God's never spoken to me.
Hmm.
And then I start asking them some questions, when they're having a quiet time, what verse stood out to them, or
Yeah.
in a sermon recently, did anything just really prick your heart? Or, did your wife say something that just suddenly stopped you in your tracks? And all of a sudden they realize, they'll just say, well, yeah, that, you mean that was God? And what they realize is, oh no, God has been speaking to me.
Hmm.
I just have not recognized his voice.
Yeah.
And so at that point, then this the reality just carry on. It basically just taught, so you've got a choice to make. You can continue on with your life and your goals and your activities, or you can make an adjustment. And a hard one is, you can't keep doing what you're doing and join God at the same time.
Yes.
My dad often, he uses the example of Jesus showing up at the boats of Peter and Andrew and James and John, and
Hmm.
Dad's famous line is, you can't stay in the boat and go with Jesus at the same time.
Yeah.
And a lot of us want to stay in our comfortable cocoon, our comfortable life, but we'd love to have these God experiences. We just don't want to adjust our life so we're in position to have them. But those who, and that's, we've heard so many experiencing God stories where people said, after I went through that course, I knew I had to quit my job and go work at this nonprofit, or go be a missionary, or just countless different stories. Some have felt led to go into politics and run for office, and so many people felt led to write a book, or start a ministry, or start an orphanage in Africa. But God spoke in numerous ways, and then they realized, I can't just keep living my life the way I have. And as
Yeah.
you join him, you start to experience God in ways you'd heard about God all your life and what he did centuries ago, but all of a sudden you're experiencing him today. You realize that same God is just as active today as he's ever been, and you get to be a part of it.
Mm. Um, the part in that list of realities where you have to change, and your dad uses the words crisis of belief that
Yeah.
has to result in action. I think sometimes when people hear belief, they think, oh, I've got to put a different list of facts in my brain. And it's not that the facts are unimportant, but you use that in a place that's far beyond a list of facts. It
Yeah.
includes the heart, it includes action.
Yeah. Well, it basically, it requires faith. And
Yeah.
Hebrews 11:6,
Yeah.
the writer of Hebrews says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And I know a lot of people, they spend their whole life trying to create a world that does not require faith.
Mm.
They've got a healthy savings account, they've got good insurance policies, they've got what may come, they've got things covered, a good medical plan. And then God says, I want you to walk away from that and go serve me over here at half the pay you're earning right now. And that leads to a crisis of belief. It's like,
Yeah.
well, what do I believe about God? Do I believe that he will, if he asks me to do something that seems crazy, will he still provide? Will it be better to do it God's way than to keep pursuing building this career that I've been building? And maybe it's just something simple as just going on a mission trip, but you're scared to death of flying, or you're
Yeah.
scared to death of speaking in public, or sharing your faith. But you can count on it that God is, whatever he asks you to do, he's going to guide you to a place where you have to have faith, and you have to believe him, and he's going to stretch your faith. You may have some faith, he wants you to have more. The
Yeah.
more faith you have, the more pleasing you are to him. And so when he talks about crisis of belief, what part of that word crisis just can mean in the Greek just decision. Just what am I going to decide about my faith? Is my faith just a very comfortable one that God never asked me to do anything I don't want to do? Or do I realize, no, I have to trust in a God that may ask me to get out of my fishing boat and walk away from the only thing I've ever known, my only security in my life. My dad, Zebedee, might be hollering, "Where do you guys think you're going here? Like, if you want to inherit this business, you better get back in the boat right now." And would you really just keep walking away?
Yeah.
That's a crisis of belief. But at the same time, I know a lot of Christians who have a lot of regrets. They'll say, I felt like God was calling me to be a pastor when I was in college, and I never followed through. I felt like God wanted me to do this or do that, and I've never done that. And we've just said, no, when Jesus suddenly shows up by your fishing boat, you don't want to live your life with regrets, wondering what would life have been like had I just gotten out and followed him.
Yeah. I am experiencing a lot of that right now in the ministry, Dr. Carroll Ministries, that God has given us to do. And there have been certainly times when I, look back and say, okay, we tried this, we put so much effort into this, and it seemed like that didn't really work. But then at other times, and that's what's going on right now with us, it's like God is opening the door, and it's, in some ways, it's scary because it's you're gonna have to change and start doing something on faith and doing something different than what you've done. But the exhilaration of walking there with God and experiencing Him. You said a little bit ago, it's like you're swept up in something that is so many orders of magnitude bigger because it's God who's doing it.
Yeah. Well, and that's true. And I've also discovered that sometimes I did something that I thought I felt like that's what God wanted me to do, and then it just didn't seem to work out like I thought it would. And I would kind of file that away as under failures or disappointments, or at least, one of the nothing to write home about. And then 10 years later, I learned of some things that happened in that meeting, that ministry, that
Wow.
I had never heard about. And I literally remember a time I was in a conference for 2 days with 4 other speakers, and I was the junior speaker for sure. And everybody else was a famous person, and I felt just so ordinary. I remember after the first time I spoke, everybody else had like met with world leaders and done all these things, and all my illustrations were about messing up trying to raise one of my kids or something, and I just thought, these guys are going into the White House and they're doing all these things, and their sermons were riveting. And I remember going home after the first night, and I went to my hotel room, and I remember kneeling down by my bed saying, God, did I just make a big mistake? I don't even belong here. I don't fit in with all these star-studded celebrities who are speaking here. And I just thought, God, just help me to finish this thing well, and I'll just have to be more careful about what I agree to do next time. And I always figured that was a failure. And then 10 years later, I was back in that same state speaking at something else. A pastor came up to me, and he referenced that earlier meeting 10 years before. He said, do you remember that meeting where you were speaking? And I said, oh yeah, I remember it. I didn't say, yeah. And that was one of probably the most disappointing, things I've done. And he said, all those guys were good. He said, but when you started speaking, he said, I could relate to you. I'm an ordinary person like you. And he said, when you started speaking, he said, I just came unglued. He said, I was so shaken that you stopped just before your sermon was over, right before dinner, and everybody was heading out to restaurants to eat. I was with a group of other pastors. He said, you go on without me. I have to go do business with God. He said, I went back to my room. I got down on my knees, and I just said, God, after I've just heard you've got to completely rebuild me and change me and forgive me. And I got all choked up. I said, well, I'm so glad you told me that. I said, because while you were on your knees getting right with God, I was in my hotel room on my knees saying, God, have I just messed up? Did I not even hear you? And so I've learned that, part of walking with God is also having the spiritual eyes. And I mean, sometimes you just won't know. You can't see what's happening in someone else's life, but just trust that if God did lead you to do something, it may even seem disappointing or confusing, but just wait. You haven't heard the last of God's story yet.
Thank you for that. What a powerful illustration. You have been the editor of the Experiencing God CSB Bible. And that's one of the current things that your ministry has poured into, that you have poured into personally. And I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about that.
Sure.
Whether or not people have been aware of experiencing God before, talk about this Bible, the Experiencing God Bible, and what you were hoping for that, what your goal was in editing this.
Yeah, well, during COVID, a lot of things were shut down. I had about 100 different trips that were canceled, and so but then very quickly, some publishers came back to me and said, "Hey, this Experiencing God Study Bible was out years ago. It's been out of print, but it blessed so many people, and it's not designed to be real heavy on a lot of technical stuff as much as trying to help you experience God as you're reading the Bible,
Yeah.
and to just see others who experienced God as they were also reading those same verses, and so they asked if I would just totally overhaul it, update it, and so they've really done a beautiful job on it, and it's designed as a devotional kind of Bible where it'll have some insights and some things to help you just know the background of some of the verses, but primarily it's just wants you to think. And I watched my dad teach the Bible all of his life and all my life, and he people would just always he'd unpack the Word of God, and people would just say, "I've never seen that, Henry.
Yeah.
I've read those verses for years. I've never noticed that. Why did you see that?" And so people have always just said, "Well, uh, how I'd love to know how Henry Blackaby reads the Bible, why he sees things. It's there. He's not making it up. I just didn't notice it." And so this whole Bible is kind of designed to help people just notice things that are there, that are impactful, that could really speak to you, just that you might not have noticed it. And so, and we also this past year, I also overhauled the Experiencing God study itself, and
Good.
redid that as well. So it's a fresh look that came out just in April also. So, that's interesting that material's been out over 30 years now, and the publisher was telling me it's still one of the strongest
Wow.
Bible studies they've had after 30 years. They said it's just there's nothing like it. They said we have lots of new studies that really spike and they do well and very popular for a season, and then they kind of are done. People have been there, done that, but they said Experiencing God just seems to keep speaking to a deep felt need that doesn't ever get satisfied. People just keep wanting more. And I have people come up with tattered books. They'll just tell me that they've gone through that material over and over again because God just keeps speaking to them through that. So
Yeah.
we're really excited. I'm waiting. It's brand new. I think in fact the first shipment of books, Bibles, were all sitting on a container ship trying to get unloaded. So I think I should have had one in my hands already, but I'm expecting one any day. And
Yeah.
I've seen the pictures of it, and they're beautiful. They've done a really beautiful job of putting this Bible together. It's something I think people could really treasure and just use as a study Bible of just spending time with God, just hearing what He has to say.
Yeah. Well, by the time our conversation airs, I believe it's likely our listeners will be able to get the Bible. You can order it now.
Yeah.
And hopefully by the time this airs, it will actually be, they can get it at Amazon Prime the next day or from, Blackaby Ministries. We'll make sure all the links are there.
Good.
We'll make sure that the links to the study also updated from April are, under this video and in the show notes. And just the place where I just want to kind of add my testimony one more time. As I was just leafing through this material and preparing for our conversation right now, it just leaped out in my own soul where I am in that experiencing God process. And for me, in this season, ministry-wise, it was absolutely, I know what God has said. And so now stepping out in faith and adjusting the major adjustments that I need to make and stepping out in faith and action, it was so clear to me what that next place is for me in my own experiencing God journey. And I think that this will do the same for any people who either for the first time or for the 50th time are looking at this.
Wow. Well, thank you. And I think it's kind of like going to the doctor. I think a lot of people have been faithfully going to church and doing, being Christian and moral. But now and then, I think we just need to get real close to God himself and just realize we can get so busy serving God that we're
Yes.
not enjoying him anymore.
Yes.
We're talking about God, but we're not experiencing God. And I just think God, he's never satisfied just because you know about him. He wants you to experience him. He's real. He's a person that wants you to know him experientially, personally. And for all of your listeners, I would just say, don't settle for less than that. If you just sense in your heart, I've been going to church all my life, but boy, I tell you, some weeks I'm not getting much out of my walk with God, or I try to pray and it just seems really tedious, and I feel guilty. I feel like that shouldn't be how it is, but I need help. Sometimes tools like this just seem to have literally helped millions of people realize, just take that step back into the very center of what God intends for every person that relates to him.
Well, thank you, you and all your family, and you personally, for how God is using you in helping many others experiencing him. Blessings to you, to your family, and all that God has yet to do with you.
Well, thank you, Carol. It's been delightful to be with you today. And I pray all that God has put in your heart, that you will see him do exceedingly abundantly more than you could have even hoped or imagined.
That blesses me. Thank you. And we'll hopefully stay in touch.
Thank you.
Oh, friends, if you are wanting more of God, check out the Experiencing God resources. You'll find the links under this video to the book, the study guide, the Experiencing God Bible that just helps you experience God as you are spending your time with him daily. What does that just look like, and how can this become a part of your life? You heard me share a few bits of what this has meant for me, and I know it can mean so much for you. It will be different for you than it was for Dr. Richard Blackaby, than it has been for me, but it will mean something to you because, as he said, God is at work and invites you to join him. So do check out those resources, and you can experience God, I believe, in a way that is so much greater than you have yet experienced him. I also want to remind you that we have a new resource at Dr. Carroll Ministries, Fully Alive Marriage. And this can help you experience God in your marriage. What does it look like to bring him into your marriage? As Dr. Blackaby outlined, we have to change. It's not that we just beg God to fix it or do it or come bless me in this. What is he doing? What is God already doing? And how are we to join him, align with that? The Fully Alive Marriage will help you apply that to your relationship. The mindsets, the skills, the heart work in you, and then how do you pray? We talk in Fully Alive Marriage very specifically about how to pray about your marriage and applying that to some of the really tough stuff: communication, trust, sexuality and intimacy, bad behavior. What does it look like in those specific parts of your relationship? So, Fully Alive Marriage, you'll find that link under this video as well, and I would love to see you in that course. Thank you for sticking with me in this video, and until next time, now go and live well.